Welcome to Thrive, a Paychex business podcast. Your blueprint for navigating everything from people to policies to profits. And now, your host, Gene Marks.
First of all, thank you for joining me.
Glad
that you are here.
Absolutely.
How long have you been running the society?
Just over 3 years. I June 1 made three-year anniversary here at the Society.
Are you a CPA?
I am.
I
am a CPA.
And you still maintain your certification?
I maintain my license. I don't practice, but I'm licensed here in New York. Well, we're not here in New York right now, but I'm licensed in New York and Maryland, yeah.
Right. So did you do that? What were you doing before you took over the Society?
Yeah, let's see. I was the Chief Financial Officer at the National Urban League in New York.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So why did you keep your certification through all of that? Because I have my own reasons, but I'm curious.
Well, look, I'd say the first thing is that I worked pretty doggone hard to get that thing.
I worked my ass off for that. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
There you go. So part of it is just a point of pride.
Yeah.
Pride. I'm proud to be a CPA.
Yep.
And I don't have any regrets on becoming a CPA. Now, in New York, the way New York defines the practice of accountancy, I didn't have much of a choice in terms of getting licensed in New York to stay appropriate. But now in New York, you know, as CEO, you can make a case that I don't necessarily need it in the same sort of way.
Sure.
But I'm active. I do the CPE and everything. I have renewals coming up before the year's up. So
it's funny with me as well. I love the profession. Yeah. I've always been passionate about the profession.
Yeah.
I'm like you, super proud to be part of it or whatever.
Absolutely.
Why do we have a recruiting issue?
Yeah, I think it comes down to relevancy and just not telling good stories. We lean too hard into things that are not going to appeal to anyone. And I think if we go back to our younger selves, we should sometimes ask ourselves, would I be interested in that?
Yeah.
Well,
give me an example. Like, what do you mean?
Easy. Anyone during a busy season, whether taxation, audit, or whatever, to where they're saying, I'm working 8 hours a week, or I'm working 90. I had to sleep at my desk, get this thing done. And you say that to a group of students.
Yeah, it's not great. That is not great.
I'm pretty sure they don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
Now, might that have happened? I mean, there's a whole different conversation on whether there's a way you could structure your business so you don't have to have that be your experience. But for goodness sake, no one wants to hear that.
Yeah.
Not if you want to recruit them in.
Yeah, it's not a badge of honor. It really isn't.
Not anymore.
It's funny. I think it's changed with young. Maybe like back in the day, it was a thing where like, hey, there's 100-hour weeks on Wall Street or there's 80-hour weeks during busy season.
Yeah, how about that?
It was like a thing, but it's changed. I think if you tell that story to a kid right now who's 21 years old and in college, they're like, screw that, man. I don't want to be in that.
Right,
do that
right.
as a living.
And when you combine that with that relevancy issue, telling a good story issue, with not always having, even though we're much better, but being competitive in terms of salaries, if we're not competitive enough, and we're all in the midst of a huge licensing movement. Yeah. New York has its own story to tell on that. But when you combine all those things together, and then you're also hearing, I'm just saying what I've heard.
Yeah.
It's not all true, but I got to take this hard test, and I have to go to school for all these years, and I'm not going to get paid as much as my friend who went to school 1 year less than me. And by the way, I'm going to work my butt off the whole time. Yeah, I don't want to do that. Count me out. Let me find another profession.
What's going on with New York State licensing right now?
Well, we've got a pathway going forward. We have in our legislation 120 credit hour plus 2 years.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Moving forward on there, it includes consideration for mobility, knowing that that's important.
Good.
In there. I'm happy to say, literally as of us talking today, yesterday, the New York State Assembly passed that unanimously. Now, the New York legislative session ends this week for the Assembly and next week for the Senate. I think I have that right. But we're waiting for the Senate to hopefully do the same in the near future. We're very hopeful.
I have a really stupid question to ask. Why would the Senate care? Why would you've got the profession, you've got the CEO of New York Society of CPAs saying this is what we think would be the right thing for qualification. I don't know, if I'm a New York senator, I'm like, all right, guys, if that's what you want to do,
why would I care? Right, and I think that we had a unanimous vote in the Assembly.
Probably say something
that
right?
speaks to it.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you don't want to just win, you want to You want to be able to spike the ball a bit. So we're hoping for similar, but I'll take a majority in the Senate. But, the reality is it also comes down to telling the right story and telling a good and fair story. If there's something that, even if I see it online or whatever, that still boils me over, is anyone saying that anything is going away? That the two things that bug me about the whole conversation is that 150 is going away. Wrong. Well, there are a small handful of states where that might be a possibility, but I put might in capital M, might. Okay. So let's say overwhelmingly, it's not going anywhere. In New York, for what we're proposing, it would not go anywhere. If you like 150, you want to do 150, you still can do it. It's not going anywhere. Okay. The other part that really burns me up is that we're lowering standards. That is outright BS. Because if you're going to say that, then you're going to say that pretty much anybody that took the exam on paper, I'd be one of them. Yeah. I took 120 credit hours. Yeah, me too. I had 2 years of experience. Yeah, I do not have a master's degree. I kind of would like to have one, but I don't have one. Yeah. And I think I've done pretty okay. So to say we're lowering standards is that's just stupid to me. I couldn't agree with you more.
You had mentioned before about like telling that good story and having these guys like to recruit people to the profession. Yeah. I've spoken to a few people here at Engage that talk about the profession does not position CPAs in the right way. Like you don't have to be doing an audit or a tax return to be a successful CPA. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, I think what you just said, I would repeat it verbatim. We don't position people well. I don't think we need to at all step away from talking about audits as something that's a line of business. I mean, it's the one thing we do have the natural monopoly on, so that's a good thing. We're fortunate that people assume that we'd have that monopoly in taxation. We don't. Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with still talking about those. But I think if we're going to grow the profession, I mean, let's just not just stem the tide, but actually grow the profession. We need to lean into also talking about those other areas. Yeah. Whether it's client advisory, even if we're going down to straight managing the finances on a fractional sort of basis, but all those sort of things that you can do that just by virtue of being a CPA, you will be considered an expert. Yep. There are so many times, particularly when I was doing consulting, to where I knew that my being a CPA made the difference because they just made the assumption. They were correct, but they made the assumption that, this person knows how to help my business survive and thrive.
It's fascinating. So I got my license back in 86 or 87 or whatever. Yeah. It still has the same credibility that it had 40 years ago. I mean, it's still those people, they see CPA and that there's this automatic assumption that you have an understanding of numbers. Yeah. And yet, what's changed in business since that time is that everything is data and numbers driven.
Absolutely. It's so true. I think it was Mark Hozil that said this during one of his presentations on how a student right now coming out or a new accountant or a new CPA, you're gonna know data analytics. That wasn't even a class when I was in college.
100% right.
When I was doing forensic accounting back in the early aughts. I had to learn on the job. Now you can get an entire major on that. Yeah. I think that's amazing. I think that's great. I think that's the way it should be. Yeah. But we don't even mention that those are even options as much as we should.
We need to tell a better story. Yeah. Will AI replace us?
No, not at all.
What are your thoughts on it?
I think it will make us much better. I think those who don't find a way to engage it in a very meaningful way will find themselves replaced, sure. But it won't be the AI's fault. It'll be your colleagues and competitors that did what you didn't do.
How do you engage it in a meaningful way?
Places like now. Okay. Places like here, at the risk of sounding like a commercial, the one session I've gone to since I've been here, because as CEO, I'm admittedly just trying to meet as many people as I can, my members, and connect with people. And if I can get a session in, that's great. Yeah. But the one session I made sure I sat in on part of was the pre-conference session on AI. I was like, that's the one I got to make sure I see.
And what did you learn?
I learned that my prompts are way too basic.
It is all about the prompts, isn't it? It really is.
I learned that my prompts are not nearly where they need to be.
You do figure you go into ChatGPT and you make a prompt and you think it's just going to understand what's going through that little brain of ours. And it does not do that, right? I mean, it really matters on how it's done. So that was one thing you learned.
Yeah, it was a great session. And you know what? That room was packed.
Yeah.
It was absolutely packed. I arrived a little late due to a schedule conflict, and I couldn't find a seat.
Yeah.
Until someone said, there are these, because no one ever wants to sit there. There at this table, front and center, there are 5 open seats. So there I went. But it was an exceptional session. But I think you gotta, if you're not engaged with it, no pun intended, you will find yourself in jeopardy. And I don't think it'll be that long.
How do you think it'll evolve within the profession?
Gosh, if I knew that.
I'm asking you to take some guesses here.
All right, here we go.
And by the way, sometimes it's, you must say you go to these things where the futurist is speaking. And I'm like, I don't even know what the weather's going to be tomorrow, let alone this futurist saying what it's going to be. But I mean, you can see certain things evolving. Where do you see it evolving?
I'm very excited about some of the more basic tasks that will be going away. I just don't see why would they stay?
Right.
And then as people use it more, they learn. Like I learned that my prompts are still way too simple or just aren't asking enough to get the result I want. So it's my fault, not the tool's fault. I think we're going to see a real significant adjustment there. I think this is where I'd be really excited if I were a younger professional.
Yeah, me too.
Because I think you're going to have the ability to scale in such a massively fast way with credibility because you'll have the AI supporting you.
Yeah.
So you'll be accurate. I mean, as long as you've done the things you need to do in terms of making sure you have it set up right. You'll be accurate. Your ability to scale will be just so wild that I think we're going to see completely different models of even organizations. Maybe I think that's going to be a real interesting thing. It becomes more interesting, I suppose, considering all the conversations we're having right now with business structures, the effect of private equity, ESOPs, all other quote alternative practice structures. I'm not sure we'll be able to use the word alternative with them anymore.
Right.
But I think all of it's going to come together to where, I'd hate to say 20, I'd think more realistically 5 and 10 years from now, probably 5, we're just going to see entities that we don't even recognize. My CPA license is from 97. So I'm sure, the time between 97 and 2007 didn't really change that much, although I guess that's right around the time we started seeing the iPhone and, which had a transformational change.
Yeah.
But that wasn't a huge amount of difference in 10 years.
Yeah.
In some ways, obviously. But I think that time horizon is going to be so different. I think we'll see different entities very shortly.
I walk around even here at Engage, and I do see companies offering already like AI solutions.
Sure.
That'll do tax research or do bookkeeping, that kind of stuff, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, should CPAs be afraid of that? I mean, should they lean into it? I view these things as just tools to help them be a better professional.
Yeah. I think it is absolutely that. I think it's a tool to be a better professional. Here's where I think if I were in that kind of practice and there was an AI tool that, let's just stick with the research, I'd be all over it.
Yeah.
I'd be all over it right now. Why would I be on it right now? Because I'm on limited time.
Yeah.
Because initially, while I'm using it, the general public won't recognize just how efficient I've become.
That's right.
And they're going to say, you're just amazing. You'll have this advantage for a while.
Yeah.
I fully suspect, much like, there are people who, from certain products, have been able to do their own books, do their own taxes. Oftentimes it works out fine, particularly if the software is solid. Sometimes it does not.
Sure.
I think so many things that we're used to having CPAs do, technology will allow that to be more and more.
Yeah.
So in some cases, you'll be needing to think about ways to play catch up, but I don't know what it is, but I am sure there will be that thing, or more than likely things, that by virtue of this technology will be an offshoot we never would have predicted.
Don't you also think that it's almost like watching a YouTube video or having an expert help you? I don't have a single client who is going to do any tax research on they're not going to go to Tax GPT and have answers to their tax problems. They wouldn't trust themselves to even do that.
Right.
And even if they did, they probably still wouldn't even understand the answers. They're going to need a professional to explain it to them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same kind of thing. And sometimes people don't really. There's WebMD has been around for ages.
Sure.
If you've got the sniffles and you look it up and you're okay, you can get an answer from WebMD, but you're kind of still talking to your doctor about it, right? Like it's just another source.
Well, and interesting enough, WebMD is a great example.
It is
because so much to the point. No shade on WebMD, but you have what Dr. Google, Dr. WebMD, and how often do people misdiagnose themselves on things on there that you need that additional help? Now, clearly, many in the medical profession are already relying upon technology, already relying with the AI to help them think through things. But heck, I will freely admit there are many things that I use ChatGPT on to help spur me along.
Me too.
Help me get to that point, but then I look at it still with my own thing. Okay, that doesn't quite sound like me, or that doesn't quite make sense. But just as often, it's like, oh wow, didn't consider that. I agree. Let's go down this path instead.
Couldn't agree with you more. And to me, it's another expert opinion that you can have who is right about 80% of the time. But then again, who's right 100% of the time anyway?
Right.
It's just another source. Okay, let me pivot a little bit.
Sure.
So Kevin, like you deal with like all sorts of CPAs in the States.
I do.
All sorts of CPA firms in the States as well.
That too.
You've been doing this for 3 years now? You've been doing this? Okay.
Yeah. Longest and fastest 3 years of my life.
So you've had some time to have some skin in the game.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah.
Who turns you on? Like when you must come across some individual CPAs and firms where you're like, these people have got their act together.
Yeah.
I love these guys.
Yeah.
They're crushing it.
Yeah.
Without naming names, of course. But like,
I won't name names, but I can tell you, as you said that, there were a bunch of different ones that pop in my head. Now, what's interesting, though, is that one popped in my head is an enormous firm, $1 billion firm, but the leaders at that firm are so cutting edge that I'm like, every time I'm with them, I'm like, they're going to take over the world.
Give me an example of what do you mean by cutting edge? Like, what do they do?
They somehow have found a way, despite their size, to listen to many levels of employee and staff. Cool. To where in the place I'm thinking of, I went down their elevator near Grand Central, and one of their staff people, and they just started getting in a conversation with me, and I asked them whatever, and I'm going to assume, CEO, but it's not like I'm. Yeah. Someone's going to necessarily recognize. And they were giving me those information. It's like, wow, okay.
Wow.
They really have. They've really got the culture right where it needs to be. Yeah. These folks are going to take over the world. But then I also think of a number of smaller practitioners that are right there, to where if I have a question about digital assets, for example, there's only 2 of my members I will call, because they will give it to me straight and they'll walk me through it.
So what you're saying is these people like really know their stuff.
They know their stuff.
They pick some kind of specialty and they know it inside and out.
And they are consistently younger CPAs.
That's great.
With no insult to my seasoned one, and heck, I'm right in that bucket. But I find them, I get really excited about what I see some of the younger CPAs doing, because they're not hampered by some of the things that, good and not so good experiences. They're just like, I'm going to use the CPA and I'm just going to, tear up the world.
Right. Yeah. That's great. So if you were to quit as CEO of the New York State Society of CPAs,
all right,
and that's not the case. You're going to be there forever.
Yeah.
Long and happy life there. But let's just say hypothetically, okay?
Hypothetically, all right.
You've had enough exposure to the profession at this point.
Yeah, for sure.
Say you were going to open up your own CPA firm. What would you do?
Oh, yeah.
What kind of firm would it be?
I actually have thought through this a bit.
And by the way, I'm not to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Everybody does. I mean, even people at Paychex, people like work at like large companies. They're always thinking like entrepreneurial, like if they were like whatever. So
and truth be told, I while it may or may not have been part of my job description, I realized pretty early on, to do this job effectively, I have to actually think entrepreneurial.
Good.
For the society, because the old model doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't work.
Yep.
That's the model that was there when I was there. But what I would do is, I spent a few years doing fractional CFO work, so I would still have that as my basis, because of my background, I'll have automatic credibility just positioning from the fractional. But from the fractional, it would actually be multifaceted.
In what way?
I still have a strong affinity for startup organizations, for those sort of organizations. So I would have some establishment with organizations of a certain size that needed that fractional CFO work, and that would be the consistent work.
Yeah. But they don't have any money to pay, though. That's the problem.
No. The consistent work are the established companies
I see.
that are not quite ready to bring someone in-house, but needs a high enough level. But I wouldn't need to spend, a ton of time there, because the passion project, admittedly, that home runs, when they hit hard, would be that startup work.
Okay.
I would do startup work for those firms, and I would be using technology. Frankly, most of what I would need is in this expo hall right now.
Yeah.
Because I would have partnerships lined up with them, and I would be offshoring all of my support, because I can offshore all my CPAs. Still have my CPAs there.
Sure.
And I would scale. On the appearance, it would be a one-person shop, but my ability to do work would be exponentially higher because I would be leaning into offshoring and AI, while having set clients that only require a certain amount of time and keeping the bills paid, but allowing me to go after the home runs. And once I hit home run, you just kind of leverage up from there.
And think about what kind of a livelihood you would have just doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd be able to bill at a top rate.
Yeah.
You would have flexibility and control over what you're doing.
Yep.
You wouldn't have to be relying on employees to do stuff for you, because you could be doing it all on your own. And the technology is there, even now, to help you do that stuff.
Absolutely. What I just described is doable right now.
Sure.
Nothing of it. And it could easily not be the traditional 40-hour. What I described easily could be done in 20 hours a week, or less, or more, really depending on your desire. Okay. Me, I'd love it so much I'd probably do 40 hours out of habit, but yeah, absolutely.
What's the biggest problem on your mind right now when it comes to the society?
Hey, the earlier thing we talked about, relevancy, and this really isn't even in the society itself as much as just in general, is that relevancy and that connecting to all parts of our profession.
Yeah.
I love the state society. I mean, it'd be terrible if I didn't in this role. We have a age skewing issue to where I am slightly above. I'm not going to pretend I'm below, but only slightly above our average age. And that's normal.
Yeah.
That's normal. Now, part of that, of course, means connecting in a much more effective way with younger members. We have a ways to go. Everybody does, but so we're not unique in that regard. But even more so, making sure that we're making the case and showing that the profession can be fun. It can, all those things. We have a ways to go on that. So, all the things that end up frustrating me also excite me, because I know that they're fixable.
Yeah, they're not insurmountable issues.
They're not insurmountable issues as well.
You need time, and you need better communicators.
Yeah,
right?
and
like yourself.
Way better communicate. Well, thank you. But better communicate, and yourself, obviously. I truly think it is one of the best times to be. Part of the reason I get excited about being in this job is probably envy. Of my, I don't say young or old or seasoned. I tend to say, CPAs from the computer. If I had taken the CPA exam on a computer, I'd be wildly excited right now. If knowing what I know now and know what the opportunities are, I think it's an amazing time to be in the profession. We just need to tell people better stories and let people see that.
Well, you're definitely preaching to the converted. One final question. So you go back to your post-college life just a few years ago, and you can give yourself any advice for the future.
Look,
what would it be?
I couldn't even hear a few years ago without choking myself up. Well, the post-college me had much more hair here and far less hair here. And what hair was here was not gray, but... what is it? What would I tell myself?
Yeah, what would you tell yourself?
Yeah, I would say...
Let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt while you gather your thoughts, okay?
Yeah.
I've gotten this question myself, and people get this question, whatever, and sometimes people stumble on the answer, and the reason why is because they're looking at themselves right now, and they're saying I'm doing fine. I wouldn't even have much advice to tell myself now. I'm happy the way things
I'd have
turned
advice for myself, though.
Okay, go ahead.
Although it's part of it is a cop, and then there's a deeper answer, I suppose. Okay. But I would say you will absolutely not regret becoming a CPA, which sounds way too on brand, but boy, if that isn't true.
Wow.
Because even...
Did you actually have those reservations when you were younger? When you were pursuing the profession?
No, not at all. I was locked in pretty early. Right. I didn't pass the CPA exam the first time and the second time. It took a little bit of effort. Once I did put in the effort, truth be told, sometimes you just got to put in the effort. Once I put in the effort... What a shock. Yeah. I passed all 4 parts at one time in one sitting. Back when one did it that way, I was all 4 at the same time. So at a time when I was not being mature enough to study like I needed to, I was down, do I really need the CPA?
I see.
And I'm sure I would have been fine without.
I see.
Wouldn't have made nearly as much money.
Yeah.
But I also would have never guessed in a million years that the guy who found a way to pass the exam in 97 would be the CEO of the New York State Society in 2025. That would blow my mind. If you said that, I would say
you're blowing your mind. Yeah. I'm sure whatever friends you had in high school, it would blow their mind 10 times more.
For sure. They're like, who is this guy?
Yeah. Wait, you do what now?
Yeah, who is this guy?
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Okay, you do that, huh? Okay. So yeah, the younger myself is you will absolutely not regret doing the CPA exam. The other piece would be, admittedly, to stay in better contact with some of the colleagues you met, because at every job I've had, and I've had a bunch, as it turns out, every single place I met people who had a huge impact. And in some cases, boy oh boy, I wish I would have the opportunity to connect with them again. Now, social media helps in that regard. But I think that would be a thing because, when it's all said and done, people, family and friends are the biggest connection. I'm really happy that one of my best friends, I haven't seen him in a while, but we have a daily email and text thing. Well, text, not email. We have a daily text thing, but he worked with me at Anderson.
Yeah, that's great.
30 years ago.
It's unbelievable.
So, we're still in contact.
It's never too late. There really isn't. And I got an issue. There could be guys that you haven't, because I've done this when I was at KPMG. I've reached out to partners recently. Always happy to hear from you. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Like, there's just nobody that's going to be like not returning your calls. You had a relationship with them back then.
No doubt. No doubt.
Calvin, thank you. It's a great conversation. I appreciate all your advice.
It's a pleasure.
This was a pleasure. And it is. You're right. It's always a pleasure. So appreciate it. Appreciate your time, sir.
Absolutely.
Do you have a topic or a guest that you would like to hear on Thrive? Please let us know. Visit payx.me/Thrive Topics and send us your ideas or matters of interest. Also, if your business is looking to simplify your HR, payroll, benefits, or insurance services, see how Paychex can help. Visit the resource hub at paychex.com/works. That's WORX. Paychex can help manage those complexities while you focus on all the ways you want your business to thrive. I'm your host, Gene Marks, and thanks for joining us. Till next time, take care.
This podcast is property of Paychex Incorporated 2025, all rights reserved.